So I want to ask you some more specific questions, or not precisely that. I would like you to discuss more specifically, if you wouldn't mind, some of the things that you've outlined as so intensely positive. And I can throw out some reminders. These are chapter titles from The Rational Optimist, and then maybe we'll move to how innovation works. You talk about feeding 9 billion, for example, which is that's a remarkable story, and I've read it in various sources. But we have biologists in particular in the 1960s were absolutely certain, Paul Ehrlich, for example, that we were all going to perish of starvation if starvation combined with an absolute dearth of raw materials by the year 2000. And that hasn't happened. It's decided now. The biologists might say, the Malthusians might say, yeah, well, we got the time frame wrong by a couple of decades, but the other shoe is still going to drop. But nonetheless, when you make a prediction, you have to include a time frame, or it's not a prediction.
Well, no, but they can't even really make that claim, because during that period, not only have we, since the early 60s, we've doubled the human population, but we've slightly shrunk the amount of land we put under the plow every year. There's been a 68% reduction over 50 years in the amount of land needed to produce a given quantity of food. That's the most extraordinary phenomenon. It's basically the story of the Green Revolution.
You make the case there too that without that occurring, and that is a concept, we should go into the Green Revolution to some degree, because lots of viewers won't know about that, unbelievably, even though it's arguably the biggest story of the last 50 years in some sense. You make the case that had the Green Revolution not taken place, and so that was partly a consequence of careful breeding of new foodstuffs like dwarf wheat and the manufacture of nitrogen-fixing fertilizers, we would have already used up land space equivalent to more than the entire Amazonian rainforest. We would have converted virtually all arable land on Earth into food production, and we haven't done that. And in fact, I believe now there are more trees in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago.
Oh, yes, definitely. The whole world is now reforesting fairly rapidly. When I say the world is net reforesting. Some places are still losing forests, but on the whole, places like China are gaining woodland at an extraordinary rate.
Yeah, well, China has more woodland now than it did 30 years ago, despite the fact that, they just declared this week or last week, the Chinese government just declared the eradication of extreme poverty in China. And, you can be cynical about that and claim that it's totalitarian, what would you call, a posturing. But it's certainly the case that even by UN standards, we're on track to eradicate extreme poverty according to the UN definition of extreme poverty, by 2030. And we've halved it from the year 2000, I believe, to the year 2010. It was cut in half. But it's absolutely phenomenal.
60% of the world lived in extreme poverty when I was born. Today, it's less than 10%. That's the greatest achievement of any human generation ever. Nobody's lived through anything like that in the past.
Yes, and that despite the fact that the population, tripled?
Yes, certainly 2.5 times. And nobody saw it coming. And it wasn't planned even. Most of it came about because of, relatively local innovation. To make farming more efficient and things like that. And the amount of calories available per head have gone up on every continent, including Africa. There is still extreme poverty and extreme hunger and malnutrition and nutrient shortages and so on. But the thing I always say to environmentalists is, why do you think it would motivate people to tell them that this problem is insoluble? Why not say, look how well we've done in the past. Why don't we try and do just as well in the future?
Well, it's especially the case. This is something that really confuses me too, because I partly generated a UN report, or contributed to a UN report about 6 or 7 years ago on sustainable development. And I had the same sort of realization that you described, was that on all these dimensions where we were supposed to be, careening towards catastrophe, we were in fact doing better and better, with the possible exception, I think, of oceanic management. But we don't have to get into that.
I agree with that.
Yeah. The oceanic management is a catastrophe, but it could still be rectified, and it seems to be a tragedy of the commons catastrophe.
Yep.
And in any case, everywhere I looked at the actual statistics, the evidence was that things were getting better fast, and like really fast in an unparalleled manner. But what really got me was that the evidence, as far as I can tell, is clear that as soon as you make people rich enough so that they're not living hand to mouth, then they start to become concerned with environmental degradation.
Yeah.
And so the biggest contributor to pollution, you could make a strong case, the biggest contributor to pollution isn't wealth, but poverty. And that if you raise people out of poverty, then they start to manage their environments properly because they can afford to look at the long run. And so you'd think that for the radical types who are hyper concerned, according to their own self-description, with poverty and oppression as well as environmental degradation, that they would look at the facts and say, oh my God, we can have our cake and eat it too. The faster we make people rich, the better off the planet is going to be.
Completely. This is so clear to me, and it's so hard to get across to a lot of the environmentalists. And by the way, there's a word I want to introduce to the conversation at this point, which is Panglossian. People sometimes accuse me of being Panglossian. Dr. Pangloss, as you remember in Candide, in Voltaire's novel, is someone who says he's a caricature of Leibniz, and he says that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. And yes, Lisbon has been destroyed by an earthquake, but that must have been because they were evil people, because God wouldn't do a bad thing. And it's a very silly argument, and it's being lampooned by Voltaire. But actually, the people who say that now are not you and me. We're saying, good as this world is compared with what it was, it's a veil of tears compared with what it could be if we press on. We're not saying we've got to the best possible world. We're saying, let's keep going. But the people who are saying that, who are saying, oh, we mustn't do any more development. Oh, we must make sure that people still live in mud huts.
You outline data indicating that one of the responses by the catastrophists, let's say, of the 1960s was to write off places like India and proclaim that even aid was futile because all you were doing was encouraging increasing starvation in the future.
When I was writing The Rational Optimist in 2010, it was quite fashionable still to write off Africa, to say, yes, Asia has seen extraordinary improvements in living standards, but it is very unrealistic to assume that that could ever happen in Africa. People would say that kind of thing quite often. And in my book, I said, look, even in Africa, we are seeing incredible improvements.
Well, the fastest growing
and so I got criticized by a reviewer in the New York Times for using the phrase "even in Africa." That showed I was a racist. Apparently, you can't win, can you? I was saying the opposite. But now, 10 years on, Africa's had an incredible decade. Actually, much better than the West, which has had a rather grim decade of low productivity and the overhang of the Great Recession and so on. But countries like Ethiopia have doubled their income per capita in real terms in a decade. You've seen malaria mortality collapse. You've seen HIV mortality falling fast. You've seen warfare disappearing from much of the continent. You've seen an emerging middle class. You've seen far less hunger and malnutrition. Actually, Africa is just doing roughly what Asia did a generation ago, and it will soon be where Asia is now, which is a middle class, middle income continent. That's an incredible thing, and
Africa has unparalleled potential. I read an analysis probably 15 years ago. I believe it was by the former CEO of Alcoa, the aluminum company, who was working for a Republican government as a cabinet member at that point. I'm afraid I can't remember his name, but he visited Uganda and was very curious about its potential with regards to agriculture and calculated, first of all, Uganda apparently sits on a water table that's only about 200 feet down and it's very fertile. He calculated, and maybe this wasn't his calculation, but he reported that Uganda alone could feed all of Africa.
Yeah.
And so there's no reason to assume that, despite the fact, for example, I think it's Nigeria is on course to be the world's most populous country by the year 2100. I think the demographic projections are that it will surpass China by that point.
Yes, I believe that's true, and that's quite an interesting thought, isn't it? But no, I mean, just to cast your mind forward to the year 2100, I think we will be producing food, an awful lot of it from factories by then. And by factories, I mean vertical farms, indoor LED lit, multi-story operations that
and
are.
Why LED lit? Why LED lit?
Because LEDs are so cheap, they use so little electricity and produce so little heat that you can actually start to make indoor farming make sense. Because light was the big problem for farming. You had to be outdoors for the light because the plants don't grow except in sunlight. But the LED revolution has made a big difference there. And I can imagine us having basically some indoor farms the size of Uganda that feed the world. And the rest of the planet, yes, we'll have hobby farming and we'll have grass-fed beef in here and there and so on. But an awful lot of the rest of it will be one giant national park in which we will allow nature to thrive. And by the way,
allow people to operate as tourists. I mean, increasingly ecologically pristine areas pay for themselves with tourism. And so that brings them into the economy, which is an almost certain way of preserving them.
Yeah.
So,
and I suspect we'll bring back some extinct species by then as well.